Uh, because of that, I had time to get this lecture together, and so that's nice. So let's get started. It is uh, personality theories on the neo-freudians. I'm going to cover Jung, Adler, Karen Horney, and Erik Erikson, although I'm not really going to cover Erikson because I did him in the last unit, but he is included with these guys. They were all people who either studied with Freud or, in Karen Horney's case, studied psychoanalysis and then either broke with him or just developed different ideas. And the two main areas where they disagreed with Freud were things that you would probably agree with, that he focused way too much attention on sexual factors in terms of personality development, especially focused on male sexuality, and that he underemphasized the effect of the people around us and social factors on our development. Each of the four has their own focus, and you should I'm going to give you more information than you need to know, and you should just focus on the key ideas for each of them. Carl Jung is probably has the richest and most interesting theory of the four, but also maybe the least useful for psychology. We've studied him before. I don't know if you can remember when. Karen, do you remember? That's right, in the States of Consciousness unit, when we studied his way we interpret dreams. This is what I'm going to talk about. This looks like a lot. This is just to kind of organize you, but really the collective unconscious and archetypes are the two things you need to remember, and I'm just going to barely mention some of the other things. Jung was younger than Freud and studied with him, but then eventually broke with him, and was deeply concerned with the unconscious mind, and that's the thing you need to remember for Jung. Whereas Freud saw it as this cauldron of seething desires, or I have another quote, a burial ground for frightening experiences which still manage to haunt us. Jung thought of it differently than that. He thought it was a richer heritage and not so nasty. He had a vast knowledge of the religions and myths and symbolism of different peoples around the world, from Hinduism to Buddhism to Native American beliefs. And he tied all of that stuff into our unconscious. He also was very good at lucid dreaming. And in the fall of 1913, this is not important, just interesting, he had a lucid dream and a vision of a monstrous flood engulfing Europe and lapping at the mountains of his native Switzerland. He saw thousands of people drowning. Then, in his dream, the waters turned to blood. After that, he had dreams in the next few weeks and months of eternal winters, rivers of blood. He was afraid he was becoming psychotic. And then, August 1st of the very next year, World War I began. And Jung felt that it was not an accident, that there had been a connection between himself as an individual and the rest of humanity. And for the next 10 to 15 years, he went through a lot of self-exploration. It was often very painful, that he later developed into his theories. He recorded all his dreams, his fantasies, he had visions. He did a bunch of art. He drew and painted and sculpted all these things out that he'd been dreaming about. And he found that the things he dreamt about and his experiences tended to form themselves into people. There was a wise old man. The wise old man had a companion, a little girl. The wise old man eventually evolved into kind of a spiritual guru and the little girl became something he called anima, the feminine soul. It's all kind of mystical. Um, there's more to it, but from here he developed his structure of the mind. He called it the psyche. Um, like Freud, there was the ego, and he just thought of that as our conscious selves. And then there was the unconscious, like Freud, um, our memories, excuse me, but things that, anything in the personal unconscious, you could call into consciousness. So for Jung, our personal unconscious did not include those kind of animal instincts that Freud thought it resided in our unconscious. But then Jung adds the third thing, the third part of our mind or psyche that sets him apart from all the others, the collective unconscious, kind of a psychic inheritance. It's something we're all born with, but we are never directly conscious of it. But it influences us, just in the same way that Freud's unconscious influenced us. It influences all our behaviors, and especially our emotional behaviors, the way that we respond to things emotionally without even knowing it. He thought of things like love at first sight, or deja vu, or the fact that you have a connection to some symbols and things that you've never seen before as evidence of the collective unconscious. What's in it? It's all the things we've experienced as a species, and he thought that we somehow transmit that to our offspring. What's inside the collective unconscious are archetypes. And archetypes is a hard concept for me to understand, and I think hard for most people. I think it gets misconstrued. Basically, an archetype, I think of it honestly as like Piaget's schema, that it is an organizing principle, meaning it's a way that we tend to understand and experience the world. The archetypes don't have a form of their own, but they tend to help us structure the way we understand the world, I guess. So, for example, with a baby, in the beginning, the baby just wants to eat. It doesn't know what it wants. It has this kind of yearning for food, but it's vague. Over time, the baby learns what it can, what can satisfy it. A bottle, a cookie, later in life, steak or lobster or pizza. And the archetype is kind of similar to that process, where we have this thing that we see or feel, and gradually over time it takes on a greater, more specific form. Some examples of archetypes would be, sorry, I said all those things. The most basic one would be the mother archetype. All of our ancestors had mothers. Everyone either had a mother or a mother substitute. So he felt it was like built in that we come into this world ready to want a mother, to seek her out, and to deal with her. So this mother archetype is our built-in ability to recognize that nurturing, mothering relationship. I don't know if that makes any sense, but that we are programmed, I guess, to look for a mothering figure. And it doesn't always have to be a mother, but it can be represented as Mother Earth or the ocean, kind of any kind of nurturing, soothing, feminine qualities. Um, Another one would be the shadow. The shadow is kind of all of our survival instincts from our animal past when we weren't aware of ourselves. It's kind of the dark side of the ego. Sorry for the phone ringing. Um, but it's not immoral. It's not an evil side. It's our animal side. You know how animals can be very tender with their young, but also vicious killers. But it doesn't make them evil. That's our shadow side. Symbols of the shadow would include like the snake or the dragon or monsters or demons. That's another archetype. Persona. Persona is your public image. It's the face you put on for the rest of the world. At its best, it's just the good impression that we want to present to people. At its worst, it's us being manipulative and deceitful in terms of presenting who we are. There's also the hero persona. The hero is kind of the protagonist of our lives, and the one kind of on the journey to fulfillment. And strangely enough, the hero is often not very smart. Luke Skywalker in Star Wars is an example of the hero archetype. So I don't know if I explained that very well, but that's the best you're going to get from me. It's a fairly complicated theory. How the psyche works. Jung thought the psyche worked based on three principles. The principle of opposites, the principle of equivalence, and the principle of entropy. And I'll briefly describe these, but you don't really need to know them. The principle of opposites is the idea that every wish we have immediately suggests its opposite. Like if I want to do a good thing, I cannot help, like, should I help this lady across the street? I can't help but also have in me the opposite idea that maybe instead of helping this lady across the street, I might push her down into the road. It's drawn from a little bit Eastern religions and the idea of yin and yang, that you can't have a concept of good without a concept of bad. Leave that for what it is. He also thought about the principle of equivalence, that the energy that you have inside of you is given equally to both sides, the good of a side and the bad of a side. And as long as you acknowledge that, you'll be fine. But if you think in your life that you're only good, you are not acknowledging that other side, and you are suppressing it, and that is unhealthy. And then finally, the principle of entropy is the idea that it's like physics. It's the idea that over time, energy decreases. And so he thought of young people as being very extreme and for example, adolescents exaggerating male-female differences. The boys trying hard to be macho, the girls trying very hard to be feminine, and not realizing that we all have a male and a feminine side. That's, again, the principle of opposites. And as we get older, we get more comfortable with the different facets of us inside. So that's how the three work. He also came up with the idea of the self. The self is when you... this is sort of an idea like self-actualization. When you fully become who you are supposed to be, you transcend or move above all these things, the male and female side of you, the ego and shadow side of you, the good and bad, and you realize that you are both and neither. And he thought you actually could only fully realize yourself, your full self, in death, but you can approach it as you get closer to it. So that's his theory of um, who we are and our personalities. He also is well known for developing different personality typologies. He is the one who came up with, for example, introversion and extroversion. In terms of a critique of Jung, um, just a couple of quick things. He's fascinating, and I think he had a lot of insight into human nature. Um, his ideas, in many ways, are very prevalent. You'll hear about the collective unconscious or archetypes. That's a common thing, and it's sprinkled in literature and movies and things like that. And a lot of his ideas are just suffused throughout the culture. But what would be the main criticism of him? This should be something you can come up with on your own. If you can, I'm not going to tell you. I'll tell you in class if you can't figure it out. But there's a very obvious criticism in terms of his psychology. And then, what do you have to know? I've given you more than you need, and I went on for 16 minutes. But I would say you should identify that he was focused on our mind and our unconscious and developed the idea of the collective unconscious, this unknowable or not directly knowable stuff that we all share that comes out in our symbols and myths and our dreams, and that inside the collective unconscious are these archetypes, these ways we organize the world. Okay, I'm going to be quicker on the other ones. Alfred Adler. Adler's much more down to earth, and along with Horney, the most kind of pragmatic of the neo-Freudians. The central issue with Adler was this idea that everyone has some sort of feelings of inferiority, and that we strive to overcome them. I put Teddy Roosevelt on the slide, not because Adler knew him or used him as an example, but Roosevelt fits Adler's philosophy. As a boy, Teddy was weak and sickly, had poor vision and asthma, and he compensated not by withdrawing into the world, but by trying to build himself up. And he became a rugged, outdoorsy man's man, and he kind of fits the Adlerian philosophy. So here's key concepts. The first of all is inferiority. That we all have these weaknesses and shortcomings in our looks, physically, psychological ones, and they don't even have to be real inferiorities or weaknesses. It's just perceived. That he said if you take anybody, they all have some sense of that they're not good enough in some way. Like, I'm no good at math, or I'm fat, or I'm skinny, or my nose sticks out too much, or I'm not coordinated, or I say the wrong things all the time. And so we all have at least some version of these feelings of inferiority, and if that doesn't fit you, like you don't see the connection with any of that because you don't feel inferior. He said that the number one thing we all share is everybody started as a kid, and as a kid, all kids feel inferior because they're small and they see this world of adults around them much bigger and more capable than them, and even in their play, kids try to work on getting big. So he said, we all have a few things besides this feeling of inferiority. One is we have a drive, one main drive, he said, if you think back to the motivation unit. For him, our main drive was, he originally called it striving for superiority, but then he later changed it to striving for perfection. A drive to kind of fulfill all of our potential. And this as well is very similar to self-actualization. Maslow once said that the older I get, the more I think Adler was right. Along with this, we have a social interest. We are social animals. We live in a social world, and social interest, or social feeling, he sometimes called it, is our awareness of and being attuned to others. Adler thought this was something we were both born with, and it needed to be nurtured. So he noticed that, like, children display empathy and concern naturally for other kids. But they also can be selfish and cruel, and so if it's not developed, it can wither. So what determines our unique personalities? To some extent, we have different circumstances, what type of weaknesses we have, but it's also how we respond. He thought we could respond in three ways. Either with compensation, which was the healthy way, making up for some kind of weakness, or, as I mentioned, it could be a perceived weakness, by becoming either good at the thing we think we're weak at, or more likely good at something else. And he thought that was a healthy way to resolve our innate feelings of inferiority. But we also can handle it in ways that are not healthy. And the two main ways would be to kind of let our feelings of inferiority overwhelm us, so we give up, and then we develop what he called an inferiority complex. Or we can go the other way and develop a superiority complex, where we become kind of bullying and domineering, or attention-seeking. And those types of people, he said, are covering up their insecurities. And you can see that even more so than Jung, kind of sprinkled throughout his theory are terms that you're familiar with. You've heard of compensating or inferiority complex, because his ideas have kind of spread into the popular culture because they make sense to us. The final thing that Adler theorized about was birth order and how it affected our personality. But this might be the thing he is most known for today. But he thought it was useful. He didn't make too much of it. He thought there were other things that could affect it. But he did say that there were certain personality types that came out of birth order, and the only child tended to be pampered. The first child was like an only child in that they were pampered, but then dethroned. And so he thought, sorry about this to all you oldest children, that the first child was most likely to grow up as a problem child. Excuse me, or with a problem personality. But on the other hand, they can also be the most precocious, or kind of develop with the most talents. The second child had a different situation. They were always following the oldest child. So the oldest child had acted as a pace setter, and the second child was often in competition, but could never catch up because the oldest child was older. And that can play itself out different ways. The second child can always be competitive, or if they can't keep up, they can sometimes just give up. And I got to be honest, I can... that's true in my older brother, following my older sister, and I've seen it in a number of kids I've taught. The youngest ends up being always pampered, second most likely to have problems. And they, because they're the youngest, they see all these older people always doing things better than them and older than them, so they can feel very inferior. Or they can kind of respond the opposite way and always try to keep up and be very competitive. Like I said, it's kind of useful or fun to analyze yourself in terms of birth order and see if your personality fits where Adler would say, but I wouldn't make too much of it. Okay, this is a long lecture, I apologize. We're at 24 minutes. Here's Karen Horney. Penis envy, more like womb envy. The book talked about that. She had a difficult life. She had a strained relationship with her father, who was very authoritarian. She was close to her mom. She battled depression all her life and did psychotherapy herself. Her mom died when she was fairly young, and her brother died young, and these hit her very hard. She was not a colleague of Freud, but studied psychoanalysis and underwent psychotherapy herself. She may have the best theory of neurosis that exists. And neurosis is just kind of mild mental illness dealing with anxiety or depression. It's not a term that's really used anymore. She saw neurosis as something that was more continuous with normal life. The neurosis was, we all cope with problems in our lives. Neurosis was a way of coping. It's just not as effective as people who were not neurotic. For her, the central issue was that we all have anxiety, kind of a basic anxiety and a need for love and affection and approval. And if we get that from our parents and loved ones, we grow up fairly secure. It's kind of, she's ahead of her time in terms of Harlow, attachment, and Ainsworth, those studies. But if we don't get it, we can develop problems. She was a clinician. She saw a lot of patients, and she, in her clinical practice, she ended up discovering what she said were 10 different patterns of neurotic needs. These needs were all things that we normally need, but in the neurotic person they become distorted. For example, the biggest need she saw was the need for affection and approval. We all need that. But for her, the need became neurotic if it was an unrealistic need for affection, or unreasonable or indiscriminate, like expecting everybody to be approving of you, or needing too much affection from your loved ones and being needy and clingy. And the neurotic person's need is much more intense, and they will get anxious if they don't get it. She saw different strategies for coping. One was I'm sorry, I kind of put different notes on the slide than what I intended to say. How to overcome it is just have a secure and adapted, loving sets of parents and family members, like I said before. If you don't get that, you can develop neuroses. And the two types that she talked about were those who become clinging independent, the moving towards neuroses, or the moving away, the kind of domineering, that's a moving toward also. The kind of moving away, the aloof or withdrawn. This is not my greatest lecture ever, I apologize. If there's anything that's unclear about, feel free to ask me in class. I'm at 28 minutes, and I'm going to wrap it up. There's Eric Erikson. As you know, I'm a big Erikson fan. I think he makes a lot of sense. His central issue was the social relationships that we have at every stage of life. What we talked about with him in the last unit still holds, and you should be ready to be tested on his stuff in this unit. Quickly, to kind of wrap up critique of Freud and the neo-Freudians, the main criticism of Freud would be one of method, that he was unscientific. I think this is all review for you. His used case studies and self-analysis. His interpretations of his patients' memories and therapies was biased and subjective. And his theories, while interesting, are basically untestable. Criticism of his theory, we've already been through what he was overly focused on. But, you know, Freud is a giant nevertheless. His defense mechanism stuff is still very useful in therapy. His success in making us focus on our unconscious mind, and kind of the whole spectrum of neurosis that both he and Karen Horney said is, you know, we're all kind of somewhere along the spectrum. For the neo-Freudians, I think their theories are not thought of as they're not as prominent as they once were, but a lot of their ideas are concepts we still use. The neurotic stuff for Horney, the concepts of my brain shot for Adler, compensating, and the different ways that we deal with our feelings of inferiority. And I think Erikson is still very much in use. And for Jung, I think he's less used in psychology now, but he's more just kind of moved over into our cultural understanding. All right, I'm going to cut it off there. Hope you had a good snow day, and I'm sorry this is so long. I'll try to be better on the next ones. All right, let's close this out. Bye, everybody.